Would you, who was your ideal man? Who?
My ideal man?
Yeah, who would you like to really?
Besides Edgar and
Of
you
course,
two guys.
of course.
Yeah, anybody.
Good morning. It's Monday, Cold War Monday, March the 2nd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Varney and Company, motivation, meditation, and the Cold War. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. The Anna Maria beginning of Stew.
Wall Street down, industrials down 541, NASDAQ down 389. Let's check defense stocks. This is the place to hide this morning with this Operation Epic Fury. We are looking at money moving into defense stocks as expectations call for an increase in defense spending. The other major market to watch, oil. Take a look at prices right now, which of course have been spiking. The price of Brent and the price of crude both up 8% as we speak. We're continuing this coverage tomorrow morning. Stay with Fox Business. Varney and Company picks it up now. Stu, take it away.
All right. Good morning, Maria. Good morning, everyone. It was a bold strike. Decapitate the leadership of a hostile power and degrade its military capability. Operation Epic Fury is now in day 3. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth told a news conference about an hour ago, quote, "If you kill or threaten Americans anywhere in the world, then we will hunt you down and we will kill you." These developments. Following the death of Khomeini and 40 top leaders, the Iranians have formed an interim ruling council with Ali Larijani as its leader. He is now a target. Iran continues its attacks on its Gulf neighbors, but that's not gone down well. Arab states now oppose Iran's Shia regime. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has joined the fight. Israel has responded with attacks on Lebanon. 4 dead among American forces. Separately, 3 F-15s brought down by friendly fire. Some successes to report. General Jack Keane says Iran's missile capability has been degraded by 60% already, and only 10% of rockets fired at Israel are getting through. Across the world and in Iran itself, Iranians are celebrating. You can hear them shouting, "Thank you, Trump." The Democrats want to stop the whole thing now, calling it unlawful and unnecessary. AOC predicts the war will be catastrophic. It's a fast-moving situation, and there has been swift market reaction. Predictably, the price of oil has moved above $70 a barrel. So far, however, the Iranians have failed to block the Straits of Hormuz, oil now at 72. It had been above 75. Gas is back very close to $3 a gallon, $2.99 right now. Gold has moved well above just above $5,400 an ounce, 54.03. Bitcoin, however, that remains around $65,000. No response, not a safe haven. Stocks are down, but the selling, my judgment is that it's not frantic. The Dow is off 500, the S&P is down 80, the NASDAQ is down 388. We've seen losses like this before the war began. On the show today, a shooting in Austin, Texas. 2 dead, 14 injured. The alleged shooter is a 53-year-old naturalized American born in Senegal. He was wearing a shirt which reportedly read, "Property of Allah." The media largely supports the Democrat position, which is that the war is illegal and will be endless. My opinion, this is the right thing to do, and it is the right time to do it. This is Monday, March the 2nd, 2026.
And that was Stuart Varney, Nonprofit News Now. Back in a minute. Thank you. Part 2. The liberal isn't seeking healing, they're seeking control. And the conservative's empathy is the perfect way to achieve it. Liberals will tell half-truths, spin stories about how conservatives have wronged them, and present themselves as misunderstood victims, not because they are, but because they know it will activate the conservatives' compassion. The moment that they activate the compassion, they'll own the frame. The conservative is no longer evaluating the liberal's behavior critically. He is rationalizing it. He is justifying what is, in reality, deeply manipulative conduct. This is why so many conservatives feel emotionally hijacked. They start to doubt their own reality. They feel cruel for setting boundaries, feel selfish for expressing hurt. That's not an accident. That is the result of a prolonged empathy manipulation. The liberal uses the conservative's very humanity as a tool of control. The conservative doesn't realize it until their emotional bank account is empty and they're still being told that they haven't done enough. Here's the deeper issue. When the conservative's empathy overrides his judgment, he becomes a participant in his own exploitation. The conservative must awaken to a critical truth. No one is morally obligated to understand someone who weaponizes kindness. No one owes patience to someone who uses that patience as permission to violate emotional boundaries. Empathy without limits leads to codependency. It keeps conservatives locked into a cycle where the conservative's identity becomes tied to fixing the liberals' chaos. That's not compassion. That's self-erasure. The liberal thrives in that environment because the more that the conservative disappears, the more room that the liberal has to dominate. It becomes a psychological colonization where the conservative's instincts serve the liberal's pathology. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is to practice wise empathy. Empathy with accountability. Compassion that includes conservatives in the equation. When a conservative feels that he's being pulled into the liberal's orbit via pity or guilt, he needs to pause and ask, whose needs are being met right now? Is this emotional exchange reciprocal, or am I being played like a violin for someone else's narrative control? When the conservative switches from blind empathy to discerning empathy, everything changes. He starts to understand that some people don't want to be understood, but obeyed. Once the conservative sees that clearly, he stops trying to fix them. He stops trying to get them to see his perspective because he realizes that they already do. Liberals just don't care. And that ultimately is the bitter truth. The liberal's not confused, not broken in a way that can be mended. The liberal is strategic, performative. Liberals have learned that the conservative's empathy is the perfect tool to keep the conservative invested while liberals continue to manipulate. Liberals don a mask of victimhood, but once the conservative claims his empathy and pairs it with discernment, he removes liberal power. He stops playing the role that liberals assigned him. He starts becoming something far more dangerous to the liberal than an enemy. He becomes someone that liberals can no longer control. Let's talk about the concept of passivity, because contrary to what the conservative has been taught, being passive is not synonymous with being good. In fact, passivity, particularly when it is habitual, unexamined, or rooted in fear, can be one of the most dangerous traits that a conservative can carry, especially when entangled with a liberal. See, when a conservative is passive, he's not modeling virtue, he's offering compliance. He is signaling that he's willing to abandon his own values, his own intuition, and often his own dignity in order to avoid conflict, preserve the illusion of peace, or keep the relationship intact. The liberal sees it, feels it, and most importantly, exploits it. Liberals operate within a psychological structure that is deeply hierarchical. In the liberals' world, there are dominators and there are the dominated. There are those who serve and those who are served. Power is the game and control is the reward. Now, when the conservative shows up to that dynamic with his hands open, with his boundaries soft, with his instincts muted by the compulsion to be passive, he's not diffusing the power imbalance. He's reinforcing it. He is confirming silently but unmistakably that liberals are in charge, and he is not. The more he complies, the more the abuse escalates. It doesn't necessarily start with overt cruelty. Often it begins with small requests, subtle manipulations, guilt trips that are disguised as emotional need, and because the conservative is passive and doesn't want to upset the liberal, he gives in. Again and again, he tolerates the criticisms and rationalizes the gaslighting. He suppresses his resentment and calls it patience. And all the while, he believes he's keeping the peace. In reality, he is just feeding the machine. The liberal system thrives on his silence, on his self-sacrifice, on his willingness to be the container for their chaos. With every moment the conservative chooses passivity over truth, he disappears just a little more. His voice, his needs, his individuality, they erode under the pressure of maintaining an illusion, and that illusion is designed to keep him in his place. It might be asked, what's wrong with being passive? Well, here's the fundamental problem. Passivity conflates kindness with avoidance. The conservative thinks that if he can just keep things smooth, if he doesn't rock the boat, the liberal will stop the behavior. Liberals, however, don't respond to smoothness. They respond to structure, to consequence. They respect, in a twisted sense of the word, the conservative that refuses to play the game, the one who stops accommodating dysfunction, the one who says no and means it. Passivity becomes a mask, a way to hide fear, a way to avoid the uncomfortable work of confrontation, of self-assertion, of standing in the uncomfortable truth that sometimes passive alone isn't enough to fix a liberal. Some people don't want to be helped. They want to dominate. And if the conservative keeps showing up with softness when what's needed is strength, he's not just enabling liberals, he's endorsing their behavior. What's required is not cruelty, but clarity, not aggression, but assertiveness. Boundaries are not acts of hostility, they are declarations of self-respect. And that was part 2 of the True Conservatives Manifesto. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, motivation.
If you want a thing bad enough to go out and fight for, to work day and night for it, to give up your time, your peace, and your sleep for it, if all that you dream and scheme is about it, and life seems useless and worthless without it, and if you gladly sweat for it and fret for it and plan for it, and lose all your terror of the opposition for it, and if you simply go after that thing that you want with all of your capacity, strength and sagacity, faith, hope, and confidence, and stern pertinacity, if neither cold poverty, famish or cold, sickness or pain, of body and brain can keep you away from the thing that you want, if dogged and grim, you besiege and beset it, with the help of God, you'll get it.
And that was motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you, and now, the Cold War.
The sun rose over Hakodate Airport on the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. It was an ordinary Monday morning, September 6th, 1976. Ground crews prepared for routine operations. Fishermen worked the harbors below. Children walked to school. Then, without warning, radar screens lit up with an unidentified aircraft entering Japanese airspace at extreme speed. Governments denied this for years. Cold War Black Files reveals what was buried. Subscribe. Air traffic controllers scrambled to make contact. The aircraft ignored all radio calls. It descended rapidly toward the civilian airport. The radio crackled with static. Then a voice, speaking broken English with a heavy Russian accent. The pilot was requesting political asylum. Passengers in the terminal looked up through the windows. What they saw made no sense. A massive grey fighter jet, bearing red stars on its wings, dropped from the sky and screamed toward the runway. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. Enormous, menacing, moving with terrifying speed. The landing gear came down. The aircraft touched down hard, skidding across the tarmac. Smoke poured from the tires. The jet finally stopped at the far end of the runway. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the canopy popped open. A young man in a Soviet flight suit climbed out, waving his arms frantically. He jumped to the ground and started running toward the terminal. He had one message. He wanted asylum. He was defecting. Viktor Belenko was 29 years old. Born in a small village in Siberia, he had risen through Soviet military aviation to become a senior lieutenant, a trusted pilot in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, when he had just committed the most spectacular defection of the Cold War. And he had brought with him the most closely guarded secret in the Soviet arsenal. The aircraft sitting on that Japanese runway was the MiG-25 Foxbat. To understand what this meant, you have to understand the terror this machine had created in the West. For over a decade, Western intelligence agencies had been obsessed with the Foxbat. The first photographs came from American reconnaissance satellites in the late 1960s. They showed a massive interceptor unlike anything NATO had ever encountered. It was huge. It flew at incredible speeds. Soviet propaganda claimed it was invincible. Satellite photographs showed it streaking across Soviet test ranges at impossible speeds. Defector reports claimed it could fly at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound. And it could reach altitudes above 80,000 feet, higher than any American fighter. It was armed with massive radar and long-range missiles capable of shooting down bombers from miles away. To NATO planners, the Foxbat represented a technological leap that threatened to make every American fighter obsolete. Intelligence estimates painted a nightmare scenario. Waves of Foxbats could sweep American bombers from the sky before they ever reached their targets. In a conventional war in Europe, Soviet interceptors could establish air superiority within hours. The response was immediate and expensive. The United States poured billions into developing the F-15 Eagle, designed specifically to match the Foxbat's supposed capabilities. The entire F-15 program was justified on one premise. America needed a fighter that could defeat the MiG-25, and engineers pushed the boundaries of aerodynamics, propulsion, and avionics. The result was one of the most capable fighters ever built, designed to fight a ghost. Pilots trained against the assumption that Soviet interceptors could outrun, outclimb, and outfight them. Tactical doctrines were rewritten. Billions more went into bomber defense systems. The shadow of the Foxbat shaped every decision in fighter development for a decade. It became the benchmark, the standard, the nightmare scenario that drove everything. But no one in the West had ever actually examined one. Every assessment was based on incomplete intelligence, satellite photographs, and speculation. Until now. Viktor Belenko had handed them the keys to the kingdom. Japanese authorities surrounded the aircraft immediately. Police cordoned off the area. Within hours, American intelligence officers were on the ground, flown in from bases across the Pacific. The Soviets, meanwhile, were in full crisis mode. The Soviet embassy in Tokyo issued immediate demands for the return of both the pilot and the plane. Moscow called it an act of piracy. Japanese officials politely refused. Behind closed doors, American engineers were given unprecedented access. A team of specialists from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Air Force, and major defense contractors descended on Hakodate. They had one mission: find out everything about this aircraft. What they were about to discover would shock the defense establishment to its core. The first surprise came when they approached the aircraft up close. The MiG-25 was enormous, far larger than expected. It weighed over 64,000 pounds fully loaded. The engineers ran their hands over the surface. The skin was made of welded nickel steel, not the advanced titanium alloys everyone had assumed. Steel was heavy, crude, and technologically outdated. American aircraft had moved to titanium and aluminum alloys years ago. But as they examined it further, the logic became clear. Steel could withstand intense heat. At Mach 2.8, air friction generates temperatures that would warp aluminum. Titanium was better, but expensive and difficult to work with. The Soviets had chosen the simplest solution: brute force over elegance, weight over sophistication. It worked, but it revealed something about Soviet engineering philosophy. When in doubt, make it bigger and heavier. Engineers began carefully prying open the access panels. What they found inside stopped them cold. And the avionics bay was filled with vacuum tubes. Hundreds of them. Vacuum tubes. The same technology used in radios from the 1940s. American fighters had transitioned to solid-state electronics and transistors years earlier. Transistors were smaller, lighter, consumed less power, generated less heat, and were far more reliable. They were the foundation of modern electronics. The Soviets were still flying with technology from World War II. The initial reaction was disbelief. Surely this was a deception, a dummy system to mislead Western analysis. But as they examined more systems, the truth became unavoidable. The entire aircraft was built around vacuum tube technology. The engineers started to understand why. Vacuum tubes had one advantage. They were resistant to electromagnetic pulses from nuclear explosions. Was in a total nuclear war scenario, Soviet doctrine assumed widespread nuclear detonations across Europe and the Soviet Union. The electromagnetic pulses would fry solid-state electronics instantly. Transistors would fail. Integrated circuits would be destroyed. But vacuum tubes would keep working, glowing in the radioactive darkness, still functional while everything else burned. It was logical in a grimly pragmatic way. The Soviets were designing for Armageddon. But it also revealed something deeper and more troubling for Moscow. The Soviet Union was technologically behind. Far behind. They had made a virtue out of necessity, claiming their robust, simple systems were superior, when in reality, they simply couldn't manufacture the advanced components that Western engineers took for granted. The radar system was examined next. It was massive and powerful, but shockingly primitive by Western standards. The RP-25 Smerch radar could detect targets at long range, but the resolution was poor. It could tell you something was out there, but not exactly what or how many. The fire control systems were crude, mechanical where American systems were electronic. Bombing computers were rudimentary. The weapons pylons showed evidence of rough manufacturing. Welds were uneven, done by hand rather than precision machinery. Rivets were irregular. Some panels didn't fit quite right. Quality control was inconsistent at best. This wasn't the precision engineering of a technological superpower. This was the work of a manufacturing system struggling to meet quotas, where quantity mattered more than quality. But the engines told the most important story. The Tumansky R-15 engines were absolute monsters. They produced enormous thrust, over 27,000 pounds each. They could push the MiG-25 to incredible speeds for short periods. But they were monumentally inefficient. Fuel consumption was catastrophic. The MiG-25 had a combat radius of barely 300 miles with external tanks. A modern American fighter could fly twice that distance on less fuel. Sustained high-speed flight would destroy the engines. The metallurgy couldn't handle it. After just a few hours at maximum performance, the engines needed to be completely rebuilt. The airframe itself would warp from the heat. Panels would buckle. Seals would fail. The MiG-25 could touch Mach 2.83, but only for minutes at a time, and only at the cost of drastically shortening the aircraft's lifespan. Or engineers discovered limitations in the flight control systems. The aircraft could barely turn at high speed. The control surfaces were manually operated through a hydraulic system that became almost impossible to move above Mach 2. Pilots needed enormous physical strength just to make gentle course corrections. Dogfighting was essentially impossible. If a MiG-25 pilot found himself in a turning fight with an American F-4 Phantom or F-15 Eagle, he would be shot down almost immediately. The weapon systems were examined in detail. The R-40 missiles were huge, over 600 pounds each. But they were designed for a specific mission, shooting down lumbering American bombers flying in straight lines at high altitude. Against maneuvering fighter targets, they would be nearly useless. The MiG-25 had no gun, no cannon for close-range combat, and it was entirely dependent on missiles that were optimized for a mission that was already becoming obsolete. American engineers tested every system methodically. They photographed every component from multiple angles. They measured every dimension to the millimeter. They removed parts and shipped them to laboratories for metallurgical analysis. Teams worked around the clock for weeks, sleeping in shifts, driven by the realization that they were holding the intelligence coup of the century. The final report landed on desks in Washington like a bombshell. Classified briefings were held at the Pentagon, the CIA, and the White House. The conclusions were stunning. The MiG-25 was not a superfighter. It was not a technological marvel. It was a high-speed interceptor built to do exactly one thing: race to altitude at maximum speed, fire long-range missiles at American B-52 bombers, and return to base before the engines destroyed themselves. It had no dogfighting capability. It could barely maneuver. Its radar could be jammed with existing American electronic warfare systems. In a real air combat scenario against modern American fighters, it would be slaughtered. Everything the West had feared was wrong. The billions spent on the F-15 program had been based on a phantom threat. The intelligence assessments had been built on incomplete data and worst-case assumptions. The Foxbat was a bluff, an illusion of superiority maintained through secrecy and propaganda. And Viktor Belenko had called it. But the intelligence windfall went far beyond the aircraft's technical specifications. Belenko himself was proving to be an extraordinary source. He was extensively debriefed over months in secure CIA facilities. He described Soviet training procedures in detail. Pilots received minimal flying hours compared to their Western counterparts. Equipment was often broken, with spare parts scarce or non-existent. Maintenance crews improvised repairs with whatever materials they could scavenge. Aircraft sat grounded for weeks waiting for basic components. He revealed the pervasive corruption within Soviet military units. Officers sold fuel on the black market. Supplies disappeared into private hands. Promotions were based on political connections and bribes rather than competence. Morale was terrible. Pilots were poorly paid, often going months without receiving their salaries. He described how Soviet pilots were never told the truth about their aircraft's limitations, and they were fed constant propaganda about Western weakness and Soviet technological superiority. Many believed it completely. Belenko himself had believed it until he started noticing the contradictions between what he was told and what he experienced firsthand. He talked about the suffocating political control. Every unit had KGB informers. Political officers monitored conversations, looking for signs of disloyalty. Speaking too openly could end a career or worse. Pilots learned to keep their mouths shut and their thoughts to themselves. The system produced obedience, not excellence. Initiative was discouraged. Questioning orders was dangerous. He described the moment he decided to defect. It wasn't a single event, but an accumulation of disillusionment. The lies became too obvious. The gap between propaganda and reality became too wide. So he wanted freedom, wanted to live in a society where he could speak his mind, where his children could have opportunities beyond the grey conformity of Soviet life. The actual defection had been meticulously planned. He had studied maps, memorized fuel calculations, and waited for the right opportunity. On September 6th, he took off on what was supposed to be a routine training flight. Instead, he turned east and pushed the throttles forward, racing toward Japan before anyone could react. Soviet fighters were scrambled, but too late. Ground control screamed orders over the radio. He ignored them. Surface-to-air missile batteries tracked him, but no one gave the order to fire. Shooting down one of their own pilots over Soviet territory would have been a propaganda disaster. By the time Soviet commanders realized what was happening, Belenko was already over the Sea of Japan, beyond their reach. The defection created an immediate crisis in Moscow. The Politburo convened emergency sessions. The KGB launched a massive investigation. How had a pilot been allowed to fly a top-secret aircraft to Japan? How had security failed so completely? Why hadn't the warning signs been detected? Heads rolled. Officers were demoted or dismissed. Entire units were purged of anyone who had ever interacted with Belenko. His family was interrogated repeatedly. His friends were investigated. The KGB needed scapegoats, and they found them throughout the chain of command. But the damage was already done, and it went far beyond one aircraft. Western intelligence services began systematically revising their assessments of Soviet military capability across the board. If the Foxbat was this far behind technologically, what about everything else? Tank armies, missile systems, naval forces, everything was suddenly in question. Analysts went back through years of intelligence reports with fresh eyes. They re-examined satellite photographs, defector testimonies, and intercepted communications. A new picture emerged. The Soviet military was far larger than Western forces, that was true. But it was also far less capable. The technology gap was enormous and widening. Soviet tanks were numerous, but used crude fire control systems. Their accuracy was poor compared to Western tanks equipped with laser rangefinders and ballistic computers. Soviet artillery was plentiful, but relied on massed fire rather than precision. Soviet naval forces were expanding, but their submarines were noisy, easily detected by Western sonar arrays. The psychological impact on Western defense planning was enormous. For decades, NATO had operated under the assumption that the Soviet military was technologically equal or even superior. Now they knew better. The Soviet military machine, once feared as an unstoppable juggernaut, now looked vulnerable, held together by sheer numbers and brutality rather than technological excellence. NATO began to shift its defensive posture fundamentally. The emphasis moved from matching Soviet quantity to exploiting Western technological superiority. American defense spending was redirected toward advanced electronics, precision-guided weapons, stealth technology, and networked command and control systems. The revolution in military affairs that would define the next decades was born directly from the lessons of the Foxbat. If Western forces couldn't match Soviet numbers, they would make each individual weapon system so much more capable that numbers wouldn't matter. Quality over quantity, precision over mass, information over firepower. Development accelerated on projects that had been theoretical. Stealth aircraft moved from concept to prototype. Precision-guided munitions received massive funding increases. Satellite reconnaissance systems were upgraded. The seeds were planted for the overwhelming technological dominance that American forces would display in the Gulf War 15 years later. The MiG-25 itself was eventually returned to the Soviet Union, but not before being completely disassembled. Japanese and American engineers took it apart piece by piece. Every component was measured, photographed, analyzed, and catalogued. The fuselage was cut into sections. The engines were disassembled down to individual turbine blades. Even the paint was scraped off and chemically analyzed. When the crates finally arrived in Moscow months later, Soviet engineers opened them to find their prized interceptor reduced to parts, each one tagged and numbered like specimens in a museum. The message was brutally clear. There were no secrets left. Everything had been compromised. The Americans knew every weakness, every limitation, every shortcut and compromise that Soviet engineers had made. The humiliation was complete. Viktor Belenko was granted political asylum in the United States. He disappeared into a carefully constructed new identity, protected by intelligence agencies who considered him one of the most valuable defectors in history. He was relocated, given a new name, a new life. Years later, he emerged from the shadows to write a book, MiG Pilot, describing his journey from loyal Soviet officer to defector. He spoke candidly about the suffocating conformity of Soviet life, the constant lies, the fear that permeated every interaction. He described the moment he decided he would rather risk death than continue living in a system built on deception and oppression. He talked about freedom, how strange and wonderful it felt to speak his mind without fear, to make choices about his own life, to see his children grow up with opportunities he had never imagined. He had given up everything he knew, betrayed his country in the eyes of many, but he never expressed regret. When the MiG-25 program itself continued in the Soviet Union for years afterward, newer variants were developed with incremental improvements, but the fundamental design remained compromised by its exposure. Soviet engineers knew that every weakness had been documented in American intelligence files. NATO knew exactly how to counter it. The mystique was gone, replaced by clinical understanding. The Foxbat continued flying in Soviet and later Russian service into the 21st century, but it was never again feared. It became a relic, a symbol of a different era when secrecy could substitute for capability. In the broader sweep of history, the defection of Viktor Belenko and the MiG-25 marked a turning point in the Cold War. The fear that had driven Western defense policy for a decade evaporated when engineers looked inside the Foxbat and saw vacuum tubes staring back at them. The Soviet Union was revealed not as a technological giant, but as a struggling economy trying desperately to maintain the appearance of superpower status. The cracks in the foundation were widening. Economic stagnation, technological backwardness, internal corruption, all eating away at the system from within. The Cold War would continue for another 15 years. But September 6, 1976, was the day the illusion shattered. One man, one aircraft, and one desperate decision changed the strategic balance. Not through violence or confrontation, but through revelation. Viktor Belenko's flight to Hakodate lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact echoed through the rest of the Cold War and beyond. The truth proved more powerful than any weapon. And the truth was devastating. The MiG-25 sits now in museums, a monument to the power of secrecy and the danger of believing your own propaganda. Visitors walk past it, seeing a relic of a vanished world. But those who know the story see something else. They see the moment the Soviet Union's carefully constructed image of invincibility cracked wide open. They see the beginning of the end.
And that was the Cold War. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.